digging into JavaScript, a little bit of CSS, into the actual W3C on video and the media API. So hopefully that doesn't scare anyone. Okay. My background, just very briefly, I'm co-author of the HTML5 Developers Cookbook put out by Pearson a couple years ago. We touched on the video and media API as very nascent origins at that point. It's come a long way since. I'm also director of applications for a company in Salt Lake City called Control4, and I teach part-time at the Terry College of Business in their Masters of Internet Technology program in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm based out of Boston. If you want to reach me, I'm on LinkedIn. And then also, like I said, I'll be inside the presentation. There's also contact information for me, my Gmail and such. More than happy to answer questions as I can, or if you want to have a conversation during the conference, feel free. I tend to walk around as well, so I'm probably going to drive the camera nuts, get down on the floor and all with the presentation. We'll go through some code. All the examples I'll be showing, I'll be posting inside GitHub, so don't worry about trying to replicate the code or anything like that. I'll post it. Like I said, it'll either be tonight or when I travel tomorrow, but by this weekend it will be up. So all these code examples will be up and live. My disclaimer on that is I'm not a graphic artist. I'm much more a technologist inside the code, okay, trying to break code. So don't take what you see as final renditions of productized versions. That's where I get the great graphic artists and the very talented artists who put their nice look and feel on it. Okay, let's dig right in then. So what we've come to talk about is making HTML5, the video tag, interactive. You know, the video tag has provided a great means for us to embed video in different sources and such. And the assumption here is you may have played with at least the video tag and you know how to at least play a video in there. But we're going to take that further. We really want to create an engaging experience that could include overlays on top of the video element. It could be controlling the timeline itself of the video. Okay, and there's some neat things that we'll do with that. Using subtitles and leveraging those subtitles to engage the user that much more, especially if we're doing localizable content, streaming video around the world. We're going to use track meta tags as well, and we're going to leverage those for some really interesting solutions where we can get into things like JSON object notification, JSON object notation, and start leveraging that for even more detailed data and information on these timelines of the video tag. We're going to go even deeper into queues, okay? And then canvas. And the canvas provides some really advanced techniques. We'll touch on that. I may pull in a couple web examples, depending on our connection here, and see what some other developers have done around the world using Canvas in line with the video element and how they've done that. Okay, so what is interaction? You know, what we're really looking to do is provide information in addition to the video that keeps the users engaged. It may also do things like provide a commerce avenue for them. You know, we're seeing everything from M-commerce, S-commerce, now we also have V-commerce, video commerce, okay, where they may find an object in the video that they like, okay, if you listen to the keynote speaker this morning in one of those shows, and then actually be able to buy that right through the experience in the video, okay. Improving the storytelling opportunities, again, that was another theme in the keynote this morning, and then really engaging that user on top of just a viewing experience. Okay, being able to interact with the video, being able to control the video, being able to get supplemental information. So one note here that in the examples that we'll be seeing, one thing that can get you is a lot of times we'll be using supplemental files like VTT files, subtitle tracks. Those all have to originate from the same domain. Okay, otherwise you're going to get cross-domain errors. Okay, so make sure when you're running these yourselves that you do that. So the video tag, that's the basis of what we're talking about. From the media API set, from the HTML5 improvements. Just as a quick refresh, we have our video tag. We can add controls to it. We can put our source tags on that, our source elements. This should be all pretty standard. If you open up any of the pages that deliver the video sources nowadays, you'll see typically several different source types based on the browsers that are being supported, whether they're mobile browsers, Safari, iOS, Android-based browsers, or the desktop browsers as well. And then your fallback in case there's no source applicable for that browser player. Okay? So digging in deep, what we're going to look at is we're going to start at that video tag. We're going to drill down into a element subset called tracks. Okay? And then we're going to drill down even further into queues. Now, as we get down this stack of technology, it will become very apparent very quickly how young this technology is. Okay? And starting at the top, video is the most robust at this point across the browsers. There's still differences between the browsers, of course, and the WebKits and the like that are there. Tracks, a little bit more mature, okay? But when we get into queues, I'll actually show you one example where this completely breaks down, okay? Because it's just not implemented yet in a reliable fashion. Okay, and we'll see that, and then we'll see a potential way to get around that while still leveraging some of the neat technology around queues. Okay? Great. So overlaying. It's a very simple concept. What we're talking about is taking our video element on the bottom right there, and then overlaying some other HTML elements on top of that. Typically enclosed inside a div. It could be buttons. It could be, if you think of like an online quiz form, you could actually have the video continue to a certain point, control the timeline, stop it, and then inject a quiz right on top of that video component, even covering up the video controls, okay, so that the user can't go forward until they finish the quiz, and then restart that video timeline after that. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here, is overlaying either partially or completely on that video element further HTML elements. Okay, so let's get into our first example. So what we have here
on top of each turbine is a box known as a nacelle. Attached to the nacelle are three propeller-like blades.
Is a simple video
connect to a rotor
on wind technology. Okay, at a certain point, we may want to provide outside information based on AJAX calls to a server. There's a lot of higher level technology associated with wind turbines.
Mechanical energy.
So we're going to create hotspots. And those hotspots are going to be detailed here.
Housing. Here, a magnetic rotor
when we roll over
loops of copper wire.
When we roll over the hotspots, and the hotspots are being dynamically generated on top of the video inside a div, okay? And these divs then are being moved around to specific locations. Okay, when we roll over, we get a caption. And then at a certain point in the timeline, it's actually going to be turned off. And you'll see that div go away in just a minute. There it goes. Okay? So what we just did programmatically with the JavaScript is create a div, create an action around it, and based on a timeline point on the video, show it, allow the user to actually interact with it. We could have done AJAX calls behind the scenes for more information, to keep that information up to date dynamically in the cloud, and then pull it down. Okay? And those hotspots could be used for anything. So, really what I wanted to do is energize your creative juices of what you could do with this technology. Hotspots, if you go back to the DVD, Blu-ray players when they first came out and the Blu-ray, you could actually say, I like that watch that Tom Cruise has on his wrist in that one scene. I want to buy that watch. You could do very similar things with this technology, implementing that v-commerce. So let's take a quick look at the code here, and I apologize about the resolution, but hopefully this is going to make sense here. We have a very simple page. If we look at the bottom of our HTML page, we have our video inside the div, and above that we've added a hotspot div. Okay? Right now it's empty. We're going to dynamically put things in it. Okay? And inside our JavaScript, if we go up to the top, we have an array of hotspots. Now again, in a product version, this may be coming from an AJAX call based on what video has been selected, based on what keywords. These hotspots could also be ads based on keywords associated to that video and dynamically pulled down and then added over it. I'm not going to go into the time updates, but we're controlling the timeline, and we'll talk about the timeline updates in a minute. But basically what we're going to do is we're going to see if it's time for this hotspot to be apparent to the user, and if so, move it to a certain place based on that array of information. So here we're giving it the start time, the end time. Okay, these are just in seconds. The top, the left, the height, and the width. So we're sizing it properly. Okay. Again, this could be anything though. It could be an image on top of that video. Okay. And then finally, we're going to set the visibility to being visible so that the user can interact with it. And when we're done, we're just going to change it to hidden. Okay. That makes sense? No rocket science here, but we're allowing the user to actually interact with the video for more information. They can even pause the video. That's one of the neat things about what we're doing. If we actually move the video back to this section, you'll see the hotspots appear, even using the slider control, the progress control on the bottom. Okay? And I can pause it there and still interact with this. So if I'm doing instructional design, this may be a great way to further enhance that knowledge that I'm trying to get across to the audience. Okay. Okay. And we'll talk about the timeline update in a minute here as we go forward. Okay. So some of the key events, and there's many more on the video API and properties associated with it, but some of the key events are play, pause, ended, and time update. And time update is what we're using for the control in that last example. And the time update is whenever the current time on that video is updated. So that's really all the time this event is being fired. So if you're used to adding event listers and catching events and handling events in JavaScript, okay, this event's being fired all the time. And we can actually, I believe I have that in the developer tools in our console here. No, not in this one. But you can print out that current time, and you'll see that event being fired all the time on that. Okay? That current time, the neat thing about that current time is that's also what allows us to control the position in the video time frame. Okay? So if we want to jump ahead, we set that current time to where we want to go in the video.
What are the units?
Seconds. Okay? It's seconds. Completely seconds. Okay? But you can get into decimal seconds and milliseconds, as granular as you really want to get inside a video. Okay? But it's not frame-based, sorry to say. Okay, so some of the timeline and methods, and let's just walk through this. So we have this timeline that a video is going to take, starting at 0, okay? And in this case, we actually have hours, minutes, seconds, and milliseconds, and we'll see where that comes into play with our tracks when we get down to that level of technology, okay? But we start at 0. And we have an autoplay, or the user could actually hit play, and that's going to actually kick off this play event. Okay, this play event will be fired if we want to trap it at that point. At some point along the way, we may want to pause it, and we can use a method pause. Okay, when that happens, a pause event is also fired, or the user could actually pause it. Okay, and the pause event will also be fired. At any point in time, we can use the get current time. Okay, get that property. And then we can also, if the user moves ahead on that progress bar, on the slider, and moves the current time, then we can also set it if we want to, programmatically. Okay, so we can jump ahead, and we'll see an example of that using things like chapters or bookmarks in a video. Okay, and that's actually a typo, the pause, that should actually be a play. We can play it then again, and the play event is fired. Okay? And then finally at the end, when the video ends, we have an ended event. Okay? So that we can take whatever action we want at that point. We could produce a survey. What did you think about this video? Similar to the sheets you got here in the lecture. At the end, then you could fill out that survey and have it sent off. Okay. So time update event, talk briefly about this. You can see this is actually an output from one of these examples. It fires quite often. Okay, and those are seconds as well. Okay, so typically what I've seen across the browser stage, it's going to fire at least 3 to 5 times per second, if not more. And a lot depends on what's happening in the background of the browser at the time that it's processing this, along with the size of the video, et cetera. Size being the actual screen width and screen height size. How many pixels is it having to render each time it's doing frames? Okay. By addition, it's continually fired while the media is playing. Okay. Basically, whenever it gets a thread, it's going to try to fire this event of current time being updated while the video is playing. The frequency is not specified nor guaranteed. Okay? So it's really just going to be dependent, but in practice, it's at least 3 to 5 times per second on a video tag inside a browser page, which is typically more than enough for controlling this type of level of granularity. If you're getting lower than that, you're probably not using a browser video element anyway, right? Okay. And then in practice, this is actually how we add the event listener, time update, add our function, and then in this case, we're just going to log it to see how often it's being fired. Okay. So let's look at another example here. And that's timeline control. And the idea here is, I may have a DVD-style video. It may actually be several stitched together videos in one that I want to allow the user a table of contents and allow them to jump back and forth in between. And if you're familiar with Blender Foundation, this is just the Blender Big Bucky video, which I'll be using through a lot of these. Okay, so what we've done is programmatically, we've auto-played the video, okay, starting at the beginning. We have done a couple transitions here with jQuery. Okay, you'll see the background get shaded. You'll see the buttons actually come to the forefront. Okay, so we've done the overlay, which we've already talked about. So we've added a div overlay. We've added buttons onto that div. And now we've also stopped the video at a certain point. So we've created then a navigation menu for the user. Okay. Let me bring up developer tools. Okay, and you can see here's just some debug. Now, and we'll get into this in just a minute, those buttons are actually being dynamically created based on a track. And the tracks we'll talk about. But what they allow me to do as a user is, notice also I have no controls here. Okay, because I've overlaid the entire video with one large div. Okay, so the action of mouse overing the video isn't being received by that video element under the scenes. But what it allows me to do as a user is I can then skip to any of these chapters. When I skip as well, you'll see there's now a new little button, it's hard to see, down here, okay, which will allow the user to get back to that main menu. Okay? So even though this is one video, and you've probably seen this video from the Blender Foundation, okay, we've now enhanced it and allowed the user to interact with it much more of a friendly experience by providing this navigation menu. And you can do the same thing on your own videos. What's neat about this is I don't have to encode this inside the video itself, right? I don't need to bring someone in to actually set this all up, add the screens, add the overlays, add the markers in the video. I can dynamically change this at any point just by changing some track information. We'll talk about tracks next. Okay? So it's very flexible in this regard. Okay. Okay, so let's take a look at that very briefly here. And okay, so here's just some inline CSS. I didn't bother to extrapolate it out into a CSS file. You can if you'd like. But what we're going to do is we're going to put up cues of when we want the menu to start, when we're going to pause the menu, and when we're going to stop the menu. Okay, so if we go down, here's our event listener for time update. Okay, we're going to grab the current time and set it to a local variable so that we don't lose that point in time as the video keeps playing. Okay, and then we're going to check that against the menu stop. If it's less than menu stop, we're not going to show the controls just in case. Okay? And then we're also going to compare it to see if it's in the window that the menu should be displayed. If it is, we're going to then check to see if we need to pause it, okay, at that point in time, and whether we need to show, fade in those controls or hide them. Okay. Load metadata we'll talk about in a minute. That has to do with the track information. Okay. But this, we're building up now the layering, the overlays that we have, along with timeline control to get that added interaction. And then down below, we're simply going to have our HTML for that chapter title that we throw up in the upper left, the button menu, and then here's our video that we have as well. Okay. So again, the focus being we're trying to add interaction to this video. Okay, so track. If you remember, this is under that video element. If we look back into this example that we just had, you'll see here's our source tags. And in addition now, we have this interesting track tag. Just out of interest, how many people have used the track tag? So we got a couple? Great. Okay, good. So the track tag allows us a library of cues to be fed into the video. Okay? You can see it goes typically after your source. A good practice, by the way, is to put your tracks either in the same folder with your video or to have a separate tracks folder, okay, just to keep them all together. These tracks are accessible by a tracks array, text tracks in this case. Okay, so you can see we're just going to grab the video element by the ID and then off of that grab the text tracks in that bottom code example. And that will give us access to all the text tracks that may be associated with the video. The actual tag itself has a couple required attributes, a couple optional attributes. Kind is key because there's 5 different types of tracks that we can actually associate, and they have default behaviors with the players in the browsers that we want to take advantage of. Source is simply going to be the file, and again, you want these delivered from the same origin, okay? Otherwise, you're going to have that cross-origin error. Source language, this is going to be used for things like subtitles, where the default language of the system that the user's on will be actually carried all the way down into the player for subtitling and automatically pulled if there is a subtitles track. Label, just so user readable, we'll see where we can actually leverage that. And default is just a designation, just an attribute property on these elements that tells the player whether that's the default track to use or not. Okay? This is also based on the kind of track. You can add the ID attribute to this, okay? So if you want to actually be able to pull out a specific track, you can add that ID and then do a get element by ID on that. And then multiple tracks with different kind attributes are allowed. So you can mix the types of tracks that you have for different pieces of functionality with that video. You may want subtitling along with chapter information, along with metadata information. And all those are different types that we'll see here. So we have subtitles. That's the first type of text track, and that's probably what most people are familiar with, especially if you're delivering video around the world. Okay? It allows you a very simple way to add subtitles with that source language field being populated with a 2-letter code. It'll be picked up and automatically pulled in of the right subtitle set of cues that can be displayed as subtitles on top of the video by the player. Captions. Okay? If you want to actually add sound tracks, things like that, captions are a good text track for that. Descriptions, so more textual descriptions. Chapters, if you're going to be actually showing chapters. Okay? And then finally, metadata. And we're going to focus really at the first and the last. We're going to focus on subtitles. However, some of the examples do use chapters and things like that. But subtitles are probably the simplest, and then metadata is where we're going to get into some much more complex examples where we can actually implement JSON queues and those sorts of technologies. So track files, what's the actual format? The format's what's called typically a VTT, okay, a web video text track. Okay. There were some competing technologies, but this is really the one that has won out. There was SRT, if you're familiar with that, but really people have navigated towards this web VTT file. Each subtitle queue is separated by a blank line, so it's very easy to read these. Okay. It also makes it very easy to make mistakes in these, especially if you have long text track files. Okay. There's even software out there that allows you to create your queues in text track if you want, and it will write out properly the queues into the text tracks. Little note about closed captioning. And then if you really want to dig into the spec on web VTT, you can over at the w3.org. Okay. So one note, when running these examples as well, especially if you're on a local machine developing these can't be served up via the file tag. Okay, so you want to make sure that you're running under a local host web server on your machine for these to actually function. Okay. Okay, so let's take a look at an actual web VTT file. The first line is going to be this web VTT header line, which just simply states this is a web VTT file. Okay, and then we get right into the actual queues. And each block here is referenced as a queue. What we have is we have on the first line, which you see would be subtitle 1. This is actually the ID for that queue. Then we have a start time and an end time, in this case from 11 seconds to 14 seconds in the timeline of that video. We want to show this subtitle. This just happens to be an Italian VTT file, which we'll see in a minute. So it's going to automatically, the player is going to automatically read this track in if Italian IT designation is a locale for that user's browser, then it's going to actually show the subtitles out of this file for that user. And then finally, this is also the subtitle itself is called the text field, and that's a property that we would actually access if we wanted to programmatically grab that. One note here, on the queue time format, it's very sensitive. Okay, it has to be double zeros divided by colons except for the last 3. Okay, if you miss a 0, such as this example where it's 00 colon 00 colon 9 colon 000, the processor is just not going to understand that queue and it's going to skip it. Okay, it will try to fail gracefully past that queue. Okay. Okay. So let's go back to our timeline for a minute. We have a timeline of a video. We're going along. We've told the video element that we have a track element associated to it. And inside that track, inside that text track, there are queues. Okay? In this case, there's 2 that we know about. When we hit 1 second, and in this case, the start time is 1 second, 250 milliseconds, it's going to pop up this queue. Q1 text is displayed. So it's going to grab that text. And that text can actually be multi-line. So if we go back to our example here, it doesn't have to be on a single line. You can actually have it be multi-line. That's why the chosen separator is a blank line in between the queues. You can also format it. So if you look up at that web VTT specification, there's also formatting commands that you can use if you want to embed it this way into the subtitles and such. Okay. So, and then when we get to 5 seconds, well, before that, when we get to 3 seconds and 250 milliseconds, that queue is actually going to be removed from display automatically by the player. Okay, so all this is being handled automatically by the player. No JavaScript is required here for the subtitles. At 5 seconds, the start time hits for the second queue. It's going to be displayed automatically by the player. And then finally at 8 seconds, that's going to be removed as well. Again, all handled automatically. By default, it will put it along the bottom, as you see a normal subtitle. Okay? But in that formatting, you can actually control the alignment, where it's located, things like that. Okay? And that's in that VTT formatting, which I didn't include in this presentation. But you can easily, there's examples online about it. Okay, so let's look at simple subtitles. So this is another Blender Foundation one. If you're familiar, it's called Sentinel.
What brings you to the land of the gatekeepers?
Okay, so you see these subtitles showing up on the bottom.
I'm searching for someone.
Okay. So let's look at the file associated with this. Okay, this is it. This is all it takes to add those subtitles. You can see we have the video here. We have our source. For just this example, I'm just using a single source, okay, that Chrome understands, but you would have your multiple sources here. And then we've added 2 tracks. And notice the kind here is subtitles. We have our user-readable labels, English and Italiano. And then we have our source, okay? In our source, it's a good practice as well to add your 2-letter locale designation that the browser would use to those, so you know immediately, especially if you're outsourcing localization, it helps tremendously with that. And then what the source language, and then here you can see on the English, we've made that the default. Okay, so let's take a look at the English. Okay, here's what you actually saw there as it was coming up, 11 to 14, what brings you to the land of the gatekeepers, okay? And it will continue on through those. On the Italian one, it's the same start time, end times, okay? It's typically easier. You create your English one, copy it, and then redo the language translations or give it to your localization expert and they can actually fill it in or use the strings. It's pretty easy actually to script this to dynamically generate these if you're using a localization tool to download that file and then place the strings in appropriately, okay? And then these would be used. So any thoughts on, I've set English here. How would I test the Italian? How did I set English as a default here? Using the default keyword, right? So if I want to test Italian, I'd simply write the default here and Italian would come up. So default will actually override the locale if I want, okay? Now another way is, if we go back, okay, we'll see how we can actually programmatically override which track is being used, okay, through a mode, okay? But it's important to talk about tracks. Since tracks are files, external VTT files, okay, they are not included in the document object model, the DOM, of the event firing that the DOM has loaded. Okay? These are extra files that will be pulled in asynchronously at an unguaranteed point in time, okay, that you need to trap a different event for to make sure the text tracks are all available. Okay? So for people who have worked with the DOM and the event loaded on the DOM to make sure that the page, all the elements are there before you start working with the elements. Okay, it's very important that these text tracks, the elements will be there, but not necessarily the actual track files with all the cues available for dynamic incorporation into your HTML. Okay, so we have this loaded metadata event. Okay, once we have that, then we can actually do some neat things with the text tracks. And one of the things is we have this mode property. And mode will allow us to actually disable tracks, hide tracks, or show tracks. Okay? So if we go back to our example, but in this case, we're going to actually change which tracks are being loaded. Okay? Here we have our subtitle language. This is actually being dynamically generated. If we look at the actual file here, okay, after what we're going to do up on top is we're actually going to grab all the tracks. Okay? So here's our text tracks. Okay? And then we're going to actually populate that and choose which one is currently showing. Okay? And we set English as a default, so that's the one that in our HTML that we're going to show as a default. So if we play this movie again, what we'll see is we should see English come up. Okay, there's our English. If we change it even in line while it's playing, we just changed what text tracks get shown, and now we're seeing Italian subtitles. Okay? So if you're supporting video that's being distributed around the world, this is a very simple way to provide localized content without having to worry about redoing that video, embedding all the subtitles for the different languages. You can add new subtitle tracks whenever you want. You can dynamically add tracks, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So when we change the tracks, let me just show you this. All we're going to do in this section is change the mode. So we're going to show the one that they've selected, change the mode to showing, and we're going to hide or mark it as hidden the one that was previously, or all the rest. Okay. So now it gets even more interesting. So we've talked about subtitles. Okay? It would be nice if we could stick into those cues things other than just textual descriptions. As well, it would be nice if we could actually not have the player show those, okay, but still grab the information out of there and do something with it, like hotspots, right? Or contextual information. If you're familiar, I'm dating myself, but music videos with the pop-ups. Everybody remember when VH1 did that years ago, okay? These could be JSON objects, right, that show a specific position, a size, a title, a description, and it could all be based inside these text tracks, which could be dynamically added to video elements. Okay, and that's where metadata comes in. So metadata text tracks by default are not shown on the player. Okay, you can show them if you want, okay, but by default behavior, they're not going to be shown. And it's as simple as changing the kind there to metadata. Okay, this is where you could also have, as the example here shows, quiz information, whatever you really are interested in putting into this metadata. Okay. Now, one catch here, and again, as we keep moving down this stack, the consistency and reliability is going to start wavering a little bit. Okay. One note here is for metadata to actually be accessible, you have to put the default attribute on it. If you don't, you're not going to have access to it inside the JavaScript. It's not going to actually start playing with the video. Okay, so metadata tracks using JSON. This is the same structure. We have our ID up at the top, bubble 1. We have our start time, 5 seconds, our end time, 9 seconds. But now instead of just plain text, we're actually going to use JSON. Okay, and in this case, we've done that bubble for the music video. We've added a title, we've added a text, we've added an X position and a Y position. Okay? So you can see where we're going here. We're going to create that bubble dynamically. It's going to be a div that we're overlaying on top of the video, and we're going to move it around and we're going to change it as we need to. Okay, but first, we actually need to grab this cue out. Okay? So before this, with the subtitles, the player automatically grabbed out of the text track each cue at the right times and put it onto the display. Now that we're using metadata, we need to actually grab these cues and do something with them. So that's where we get into cues. Okay? And cues are how do we access these individual cues inside each test track and then process them. So the cue object structure. So we said there's an ID, there's a start time, there's an end time, and there's text. It's a pretty simple, flat structure. Okay? The nice thing is that text track object that we had on the video element, if we take that one step down, will give us an array of cues. Okay? And you can see here we have text track in the middle of the for loop in the test for the limit, text track.cues.length and it behaves just like an array. Okay, so this is going to give you an array in sequential order of those queues as they're listed in the text track, okay, that we can then access. And here we're accessing the ID attribute, or the ID property rather, of the queue by saying texttrack.queues sub queueindex.id. Okay, so this gives us a very easy way to navigate all the queues. We can read them in from the beginning, or we can read them in as we need to. It's up to you. Okay, but in JavaScript, we can then programmatically grab these queues and do something with them. Now, since we're controlling really when these queues are, what we do with these queues, when they launch on those timelines, we need to also be able to handle the events. Okay? And the nice thing is they come with some specified events from the W3 specification. We have enter and exit, very simple. That's when a queue is entered and when a queue is exited. And then on the text track object, we also have queue change. Okay? And queue change simply says when that queue has changed. One note here is you can actually have multiple queues at the same time. So queues by nature have a time window that they show up. It's not specified that only one queue can be up at a time. You can actually have multiple queues up, and in that same time window, if you take a point in time, you could actually have 3, 4 more queues that actually are spanning that point in time. Okay? And then we have just a sample texttrack.onQueueChange. Okay? This is, as we're getting deeper, the reliability is starting to really waver here. Okay? For those of you that have used text tracks and queues, you probably feel the pain here as well. OnQueueChange appears to be much more reliable than QChange. Don't really know why. I haven't looked at the underlying code in WebKit or anything like that. It just happens to be that way. And enter and exit are very iffy, to say the least, right now. Okay? It's problematic working with these events on the queues. We'll see how that happens. The behaviors there, it's very inconsistent, which is very problematic as a developer trying to code around these things. But we'll fall back to one of the earlier technologies we talked about to get around it. If we want to see what active queues are up, so say one of those events did fire, right? And the hope is that as people use this more and more and learn the power behind these metadata queues especially, that the browser developers will actually really work on this code. There's bugs logged in all the browser developer sites on these issues. And they'll actually improve this, improve the reliability, and we'll actually be able to leverage it more and more. On the active queues, you can see at any point in time, we can ask what active queues are available. And this is simply an array. Okay, so if there's only one, you're going to get index 0, and that's going to be your active queue. Or you could have any number of active queues. If you get 0 back as the length of that active queues, then no active queues are active right now, or live right now. Okay, so let's take a look at those bubbles. Now in this one, we're going to use the queue events and the queue change to try to effect bubbles popping up inside a video, okay, based on a metadata. So it's our same video. I'm going to actually pause it right here. You can see what we've done is we triggered that loaded metadata event so that we know our text tracks have actually loaded into this. And then we're going to grab our queues, our active queues. We're going to make the mode showing. And then we're going to keep going here, see what happens.
What brings you to the land of the gatekeepers?
Okay.
I'm searching for someone.
And in this case, nothing is happening. What we should be seeing is some events firing. But this is where the reliability really goes downhill. There, okay? So you notice, just from pausing the video before and then restarting it, we had some inconsistencies already showing up with those events, okay? And we didn't get this OnQueueChange fired, okay? What that's showing, the one next to it is just the number of active queues that are up, okay? So let's take a quick look at this, and we'll see what we're actually trying to do. Okay, so here's our loaded metadata handler. And what we're going to do is we're going to get all the text tracks off this video. Okay? We're going to debug and look through those. But then we're going to say when the queue changes, okay, we're just going to say on queue change fired. That's all we're going to do. We're going to keep this real simple in this regard. Okay? And you can see I was actually hoping at the time that this would actually work and I could do more with those queues. Okay? But we're just going to fire and say in the console log that we caught this event and what the length of that active queues are. Because again, this queue change is also going to fire when a queue is removed from the active queue list. Okay? And then the active queues will be a length of 0, showing us that the queues are actually out of view. Let me show you as well. So here's the metadata. Notice I also just named the file trailer. Usually a good idea to put the actual video it's associated with, what type it is, and then if you do have a language or a locale, it works out well to add it there. So inside that, we're going to create our bubbles. So we have bubble 1 from 5 seconds to 9 seconds, title, text, X pos, Y pos. Okay? So we're going to have the elements that we need for one of those bubbles. Right? You could put other things in here, what effect you want for that bubble, what color, what CSS. I mean, it's up to you. This is a neat thing about the metadata. These JSONs are really determined by what you want to actually inject into that video. Bubble 2, bubble 3, I think this one's very simple. It only has 5 queues in it. Okay? So this should be pretty reliable. And in fact, it's not. You know, as we go here, we may not even get any more events.
What brings you to the land?
We'll have to see. Let's try it again. So there's where it fired that first bubble, then it left. You see the fired 0,
What brings you
fired
to the land
1.
of the gatekeepers?
So we're up to our second bubble, our third bubble. We'll see how far it gets.
I'm searching for someone.
Third bubble's gone. And it basically died there after our third bubble. Okay, so this is again that inconsistency. So this is not something that presently you can rely on as a developer. Okay, it's as simple as that, which is a shame because there's a lot of great inherent solutions built in using those events. So let's go back and let's look at how we get around that. Okay, as I put here, fraught with trouble, don't look down and step away from the edge. Okay, this is really, you've gone past the edge here right now of where we're at currently with this technology. Like I said, hopefully this will improve just like the video and the source and the track tags have over the last 2-3 years. Hopefully this will continue to improve as well. Okay? Okay, so let's go back to something we know that works, the timeline updates, right? So since we're handling these queues anyway, why don't we handle when they should go up and when they should come down, right? Because we know the start time, right? If we go back to the structure of these queues, we can actually pull out the start time and the end time for each one of these. Okay? And then just compare the current time to that and see whether we need to pop it up, see whether we need to take it down. Okay? It's much more laborious. Okay? We also have to consider performance. We have to consider when do we do this check? How do we do this check? Do we loop through all the queues? Do we create a dictionary? I mean, there's a lot of things around this that we have to do now that we're going to cause ourselves to do. But in the end, I think we'll get a nice result. So let's try this. See what happens. So same video. Let's bring up our dev tools. Hopefully people are getting excited about what you can do with metadata tracks and using JSON in here and injecting things into the video. So around 5 seconds, we should have a bubble. Look at that. Fingerless gloves. Everybody has a pair of fingerless gloves, right?
What brings you to
Our
the
second
land
bubble
of the
comes up.
gatekeepers?
I'm searching for someone.
There's our third. I ran out of neat things to say. There's our fourth bubble. And there's our fifth. Okay? The neat thing about this too is we can go back at any time and we should get, that one should pop away. If not,
What brings you to the land?
yeah, for some reason it's not. But based on the fact that we're controlling that timeline, we know exactly when things need to go up and down. Okay? So, and I'm just using, for the special effects, I'm just using jQuery and jQuery UI to fade in and poof out and things like that. Okay? But it again shows you some of the neat interactive that you can do with embedding extra information, controlling that timeline, using the cues inside inside those metadata text tracks. Okay? And that's all done dynamically inside the JavaScript. So let's just take a quick look at that. And again, all this code, like I said, will be posted up in GitHub, so you'll have free access to it. I don't warranty it. Okay? We're using a extra plugin for jQuery for those actual tips. They're called Q-tips. Okay? And they're just associated with a div. So we're just moving that div around whenever the timeline hits, and we're going to show the Q-tip and allow people to actually interact. They can close the Q-tip or keep on watching. Okay? Here's our loaded metadata if we wanted to validate on that. But here's where we're doing that time update again, okay, that we saw earlier. So whenever that fires, we're just going to go through, and for each of our cues that we have, we're just going to check to see if it's between the start time and the end time. And if so, we're going to show the bubble. Now, in the show bubble, for anonymous function purposes, we actually had to extrapolate that out of that function and create a secondary function with the index of the bubble, index of the queue. And from there, then, we're actually going to use the title, the text, okay? So these are coming out of that JSON. So remember, we can access that whole text of the queue with the text property. We're going to parse that, and then we're going to use the fields that are inside that JSON for the title, the text, and then we should be positioning as well. Here's our position, XPOS and YPOS. So we're just moving that div around when we need to on the timeline. Okay? Great. Okay, how are we doing on time? Okay. Text tracks on the fly. This simply talks about how you can actually add text tracks dynamically. They don't have to be actually included in the HTML document when it's loaded. If you want to add your own text tracks, you can. That includes cues. So you can do some neat things like bookmarking. So say I'm a user and I want to I'm studying for an exam, right? And I have a video, instructional video that preps me for that exam. There may be certain points in that video I want to go back to after the fact, or even put notes on those sections that I can then study for later, okay? So here's our same video. We'll throw up our developer tools. And at certain points, we want to add bookmarks.
Brings you to the land of the
So each time I press the bookmark key here, the bookmark button, it's simply adding a cue into a text track that I've dynamically added to this HTML page through JavaScript, okay? And then I can pause this, and I can go back to those spots just by clicking on it. Okay, and you see on the bottom what we're creating. We're simply creating a queue with a start time and an end time that's the same. Whenever they click that, I'm just grabbing the current time out, okay? And then allowing them to actually then go back if they want. They could, you could embellish this however you wanted. Add notes to that, add, special offers. I mean, it's endless. The neat thing about this too is now that I have all the cues in an array in JavaScript, writing this out as a text track is pretty easy to do. Okay, you just take those fields, you write them out. Or if I wanted to send it via AJAX up to a central repository, I could do that as well and save it for them for later purposes. So that when they bring this video back up, they could have all their bookmarks that they had put in there before. Okay? I'm not going to, given time, I'm not going to show the source, but again, the source will be available on GitHub for that. So let's talk about complex interactions. Now this is where it gets really interesting and very complex. Since we can really control the video player, we can show whether show it or hide the video element. Okay, there's also canvas, And if you haven't used Canvas, Canvas is extremely powerful, especially the 2D context. And what people have done here is they've said, well, I want to inject more interactions, more effects into the video, okay? And really the only way to do that is not by, you would either have to write your own player, okay? Which that's what we're trying to get away from here, okay? Or you do what I'm showing here. You take your video, and the neat thing about the video is you can actually take stills of that video, okay, and paste them onto a canvas. When you paste them onto a canvas, you can then do neat things about it. You can actually subdivide it, you can rotate the pieces. You then have pixel manipulation on that canvas. So in general, what people do is they hide the video, they show the canvas, and as that time update is fired off, they'll grab the current image and throw it onto the canvas, do whatever they want to do to that image, but it's actually playing the movie on the canvas then, okay, with whatever additions they want. I added one link here that you can see. Cute. It's not letting me. But it's basically where a guy is actually allowing the user to choose what they want to see in the video, and he's using 2 iPhones, and there's an image that's actually superimposed. People have done green screens with this technology because you can actually look at the RGB values. People have done editing of the videos this way. Now, the one problem of this is you get into a timing issue as well, okay? Because how fast are you taking the snapshots, okay? And what you really don't have here is a frame buffering system. So people have gone to that extent as well. They've now created 2 canvases, okay? One on the very right is what the user is actually seeing, okay? The middle one is hidden, and it acts as a frame buffer for the copied images. Okay? That way you have a natural frame buffer built into the model. So a copy's taken, it's on the canvas, then you can inject any effect that you want, and then copy it onto the right. The first link here is probably the one that everybody is most familiar with. Let me see if I can actually grab it out here. This was done a couple years ago. I'm not connected. You can look at it on your own, but basically what he's done is he's copied the video over to a canvas, and then wherever the user clicks on that canvas makes the video actually explode apart, okay? And then it will come back together, okay? And all that is done through effects that he's taken from the image that's being copied and moved over. You can achieve the same, that's the problem actually, is you can actually copy the images faster than the frame rate, okay? So that's why you need that frame buffer, in fact. And so it's really based on that time update event being fired, how fast the copies are made, okay? The problem is if you're using those copies faster than you can do effects on the image, then you're going to actually back up. Right? So that's why you put that frame buffer canvas in place, is that when you're done for the first effect, then you grab from the other canvas.
But in theory, if effects is light enough, you can just do it like 30 FPS.
Exactly. Exactly. In the end, it all depends on what effects you're actually putting on there. But if you go to these examples, you'll see some amazing effects that are being used, and you don't notice it at all. That is actually, you would think it's actually the video player, but it's actually a canvas that's being sent to the objects to. Okay. Here's some various resources if you're interested. I didn't use any of these third-party libraries. I have used them in solutions, though. QPoint's a good one. Popcorn, video.js is a player. There's many players that people are developing. Again, it's kind of a oxymoron because we're trying to get away from third-party players, right? Okay, and use the native HTML player. But that's where we're trying to push that technology as developers, right? If queues don't work if events don't work for queues, then maybe we need, to push that technology. Okay. Here's my LinkedIn, my Gmail on the bottom. Code samples will be up in that GitHub repository. And then special thanks, of course, to Blender for open sourcing these videos. So I think I ran, till 30 after. but I'm more than happy to stick around, take questions. Feel free. Yes? Can you add audio effects as well? Well, the neat thing is, what people have done is they've actually, with the captions tracks, you can add in audio effects on certain time periods. And you can take that as far as you want. You could add an audio track in parallel with the time updates to actually keep it synchronized as the video plays. People have tried to take it where they keep two videos synchronized, and that's kind of pushing it beyond the time synchronization. One of them will get off, but with audio tracks, it seems to work pretty well. And there's some examples on the internet. If you Google video and audio synchronization with HTML and JavaScript, you'll see that, where they're actually playing an audio track with the video. No, so the question was, do you need a buffer for that? They're just using the standard video and audio elements, and they're just synchronizing the playback with the time update and the current time in both those through the media API. So, other questions? Yes?
Can you actually embed text track into MP4 file itself?
Can you embed the text track's MP4 file? I truthfully have not tried that. But you can, you can embed subtitles.
The question is, can browser, do we have access from
No.
the browser to the text tracks inside MP4?
No, because it's just taking it as a streaming MP4 file.
So it has to be stored.
Right. That's the neat thing about this is you can add text tracks even dynamically after the fact, right?
Right, but sometimes you want to manage your file library as if you try to embed everything inside the file itself, it's kind of more coherent how you manage your library. So you don't have different agreements. Here is directory for tracks, like all tracks would have _en, whatever. You just
Right.
put everything into MP4 file and it supports it.
Right. So for ease of maintenance, you're saying in one area being able to keep it all inside that MP4, right? Which is true. I look at it a different way, having a lot of support for years on these, that I'm having to change text tracks, and I don't want to have to re-encode that MP4 file every time a text track changes. Right, right. But this way, I can have the localization expert, say there's an issue in Hebrew, which I literally just had a couple months ago. I just give the file to them, they change the text in there, and put it up onto the web server, into the cloud, and it's done. There's definitely balances, absolutely. Great question.
Video tracks, do they currently support multi-track video files? So like when your video files contain two angles to the same scene, for example, can you switch between two different angles or whatever dynamically through the playback?
So the question is, can you use video tracks to, if I'm correct, to change the viewpoint
Exactly, multiple video tracks.
if you had different MP4 files that actually associate?
Or the same MP4 file that already contains
Right.
multiple video tracks.
Right, and there's not right now, but what you could do is you could have multiple MP4 tracks and then switch between them. Since you know the current time in that timeline, you just switch between them. Yep. Some people are doing some really interesting things with 3D rotations and the like.
Like dynamic picture-in-picture, stuff like that.
Right.
You try to combine. Yeah.
Well, in this case, if you wanted to create a picture-in-picture, you could literally, since these are just HTML elements overlaid, you literally could take another video element and put it on top in a div on top of the other video element and allow them to move it around if you wanted. So,
But how do you keep it synchronized? So it's picture-in-picture, but it's not synchronized.
if you want it synchronized, then you use that time update. So you can take the time update and at certain points check, is it in synchronization? Is the current time on this video the same as the current time on the other video, and adjust? People have been trying that, but it's a little bit too processor intensive right now for the browsers. But again, I suspect that to improve as we go forward. It's also how, now you get into the performance coding. What do you do inside your code to actually make it be able to handle that performance load? Because you saw how often this time update event is being fired. You probably don't want to check the current time and do synchronization on every event that's being fired, but maybe you want to do it every second or every 5 seconds, depending on what the video is and how much you need that synchronization. If you're trying to do video editing, then no, this isn't the venue for that. Good question. Yes, sorry.
What about a live video situation? If you could get, say, a start time from the server.
Yep.
So even if you join late, if you could get a start time from the server, that would kind of queue up where you were as far as track timeline might be. As long as is there a way in the future that you could actually possibly do this with a live stream?
Well, you can. Since it's a live stream, that stream is just coming in.
You just need those time references.
Right. And the neat thing, I've actually seen some experiments being done with mobile devices, taking live stream from mobile devices and injecting either green screen effects or supplemental details being put into the video. If you've seen some of these where they hold up a block picture and the block picture is actually changed into like a Star Wars fighter, and as you hold it up to the camera. You can do that now because what you're doing is you're streaming the live video into the video element, but you're copying that onto that canvas. That's where these complex injections occur. And as you copy it onto the canvas, then you look at the pixels, okay? You look for these patterns and you change that pattern into whatever image you want it to be. There's a neat one that they did with a green screen background, and they looked at the RGB values, and if it was in a range, then they superimposed it on this other background and did it all with a video element. Pretty neat. Pretty neat. You're definitely starting to push the limits of the processing here, but that's where we're going, right? That's where we're going.
At some point you cross over from hardware decoding and playback to software. Where does that kick in terms of your overlays and manipulation of video? Is there a good guideline or is it not well established?
It's not well established at all, and I would say it's more determined by the business needs, right? If you're a production house and you're creating these videos all the time, then you're used to creating these overlays. If you have a specific use case, like I worked with a group that was doing knowledge management and training in marketing and injecting online quizzes, injecting it into the timeline provided them the most flexibility without having to recode and work with the actual video people, because that was a completely different group. So a lot of times it falls back onto the business requirements and what the business can provide itself. Make sense?
Yeah, I don't think that's quite what I was asking about.
Okay.
About the decoding. You go back to playback.
Yep.
On your hardware. Usually there's hardware decoding that's going on and hardware playback, particularly as we get into things like 4K.
Right.
And at some point, the GPU gives up.
Yep.
You got to do software decoding. You start overlaying things, or it does overlays that you can't support in the hardware.
Right. Well, the neat thing is, as a web client developer, you're actually shielded from that. Okay? So what we're going to find is we're going to start finding inconsistencies like those events not firing or the playback starts stalling, right? So it's up to us to then decide, okay, how much can we push it, right? With all this, we don't get into the decoding layer whatsoever. We don't get into the hardware. We don't need to. It's all provided by the browser creators.
But we don't know. You're saying we have to experiment.
Correct. Correct. And we're definitely reliant on how good that code is, performance-wise and stability-wise. And it's still very young. We've only had this 3 years, the video element. So it's still very young.
Those inconsistencies in picking up the fire events, what's the reason for that now? And is that going to change?
Yeah. I mean, there's actually defects already logged with the browser developers, Mozilla and all. You can actually go up and look at the specific bugs. Typically, most of them come from a timing issue of when the cues are read out of the text tracks as a page loads. They'll miss typically either the beginning ones or they'll miss the end ones, but it's very inconsistent as well because it's all based on the timing of when, what's cached, what's not cached, things like that.
So it's not a limitation of HTML5 necessarily, but the browser?
It's a browser implementation.
Of it?
Yep. It's a browser implementation of that. And they've tried to implement it. It's just, it's been fraught with these issues right now for the events. And if you think back on other events, this is typically the growth cycle that they go through, right? They'll put them in, they'll see where it falls down, and then they'll keep improving and working out the defects, like any software. We just hope sooner rather than later. So, other questions? Absolutely.
So we require some synchronous processing in the browser in order to have some of this? Or?
Well, that's where we fall back on the things that actually do work 100% of the time, which is the time update, event firing, and us controlling when to show things and when to take them down, okay, based on that time update. So you end up having to do a little bit more heavy lifting, but it's much more reliable than the events. And as they work through those defects, then hopefully we can get those events to actually fire off properly and consistently, and we can leverage those. So you're welcome. You're welcome.
What about standardization between cross-browsers? I mean, I've been doing this for the last 2 years myself, and I find that just because it works in Chrome doesn't mean
Absolutely.
it works in Internet Explorer, and their track command interpretation is slightly different. Are we any closer to actually having a true standard that if I put a track command with an overlay that it's going to work the same way in Firefox as it does in Chrome, as it does in IE? Or do I have to basically go back to the bad days of internet video and tell people use Chrome for an optimized experience like this?
Right. So we're fighting a couple things there. So the question was about standardization and whether cross-browser support will be standardized. So the good thing is at this point we have an actual spec on these things like queues and events and things like that. The problem is we're fighting two things, right? One is each of these browser manufacturers have their own roadmaps as to when they implement those specifications, and there's no guarantees. It's up to them if they actually choose to even implement the spec. Usually it's a lot of peer pressure, right? And the second is it's different developers from each group, and how they implement it may be completely different under the covers. You can look at some of the open source, like WebKit and all, and you'll see completely different implementations based on who coded it. You can almost pick out each engineer's style of coding, right? And we're not going to get away from that. The only thing we'll get is as it matures over time, it'll get better across platforms, right? Like any of the new components that we're adding in HTML4, HTML5 will be the same way.
Yeah. I mean, just 2 years ago, the track command that came to chapters was inconsistent across browsers. It's finally started to come in, but subtitles, of course. Exactly. So as we get further down the timeline, further down that stack, we should get much more consistent across the board. Like queue change versus on-queue change should behave the same no matter what platform you're on, right? Right now, that's not the case at all. So right now, unfortunately, if you get down to that level, you're going to have to still use user agent checking and conditional coding and things like that. Unfortunately, that's just part of the game that we're in, Yeah, you can
right?
still do it in JavaScript and then backcode for whenever.
Exactly. A surprising thing in this area is that IE is actually quite far along, right? Which is not the typical story. So it just depends on the group and what priority they have for this functionality on the roadmap. Yep. You're welcome. Yes.
HTML5 only supports a few like audio and video codecs, right? So if you want to add like video or audio codec, what's the approach?
Well, so it's not really HTML5. So the question was if you need a new codec for a certain type of video, how is that supported? And it's not HTML5. HTML5 is purely a specification that says, we're going to allow here's a video player. It's up to the browser manufacturers what codecs they actually support, and that's why we go back to the multiple source elements, right? Why you have to incorporate multiple sources and multiple types into your video tag. So, who you really want to look at there, if you have a new format that you want to support, is the browser manufacturer. And when they actually incorporate the codec into their area, that it can actually be played.
If the user wants to develop and by their own like codecs, right? What's the approach? Like add a plugin in the browser?
That's one way. Yeah, and there's multiple players out there, but the players, The players are more around not the codec support, but more the consistency, the standardization across the browsers. That's why you get these like JS Player and things like that. They're trying to extrapolate out the inconsistencies. For the codecs, you're really dependent on the browser platform. So unless you want to write your own browser, that supports a video element with a different codec, you're pretty much dependent on the actual browser creators. Because they're the ones that are providing that video element and understand what source tag can be used for that browser environment. So like if you have OGG or MP4, those are specific to different browser families. Okay? It's the choice of Apple, with Safari, or it's the choice of Google with Chrome and WebKit as to what types, what formats that they actually use.
So in a sense, even though you're using the video tag, every HTML5 video player is different in every browser.
The implementation,
Writing their own player within the browser.
correct. Correct.
So you would write your own plugin, right? For example, for Chrome, right? So if you use like the medium source
Right.
API or something like that.
Yeah, and there's some plugins out there already that will take different file formats. Yep. We can talk more if you're interested.
Can you do multiple audio tracks like you did multiple closed caption, multiple language closed caption tracks? Can you do multiple audio tracks so the user can choose like Italian or whatever?
Not in the video tag, but you could actually have separate audio tags, which are part of the media API as well.
Okay.
That then you could dynamically have the user select, yes, I want the Italian audio, and that's when we get into the synchronization between the audio and the video. And the problem is trying to synchronize audio and video together, if you've ever tried to do that even on video editing, is really tough. I mean, you're down literally to the milliseconds, right? Of his mouth moved, right? But no words came out. So, that's when I would, if it was me, I'd probably lean more towards picking the right source based on the language that they've selected. If you're actually doing the audio language separately, if you're spending those resources and time and effort to put an audio track in, I'd probably just code it into a different source file for the media itself. And then you just deliver the appropriate source based on the locale that you're in. But if you don't have that back house, that's when the subtitles in this case are a poor man's use.
Right.
So, make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, good questions.
Thanks.
That's great.
Chuck,
Don't let me keep you from lunch if you want to go.
you mentioned that you got some of your source videos from the Blender Institute or something like that?
Blender Foundation.
Blender Foundation?
Yep. So they've been around for several years, and basically their goal is using Blender. They've created these open source projects, and they have about, I think, 5 or 6 now. Some pretty amazing stuff that they've done with open source.
So we can just download that and just
You can,
play around with it.
absolutely.
We're not going to get sued or anything like that?
No, you,
The website for that?
blender.org, I think it is.
Is there any other foundations that allow you to do that?
Blender's the most well-known. There you go, blender.org, featured projects. Blender's the most well-known. There's other libraries that people have posted, MP4 files that you can download free of charge. I've used, videos of my kids.
I went to Getty yesterday and I saw a price tag on that.
Oh yeah, and that's if you're looking for royalty-free. It depends on what your use is of it.
Testing our platform, we need high definition source targets so that we can test the whole process.
Right. So this will give you some good ones. Blender's pretty much the industry standard for test movies and files, and they have different formats as well.
Animated, or do they have real life?
No, most of these are animated. Actually,
Way to get real life videos, not the stream, YouTube, that sort of stuff.
yeah, there are some background services. The problem is, again, you're going to end up paying for those. Yep. Now they don't cost that much. The costs aren't extraordinary, but yeah, you're going to end up paying a lot of times for those.
Okay, we'll start with Blender then. Thank
Yeah, iStock does,
you. iStock,
Getty does, any of these. Right. And just be careful, because that's when you get into the licensing as well, and what reuse options you have. Yeah. You know, this is, if I remember right, Blender's Creative Commons, so you just have to give them attribution, you know, to their work. And the nice thing is they have multiple formats. So they have MP4, they have OGG, they have H.264, you know, and the newer ones that they're working on, like Centil and all those, they provide multiple formats. So, and multiple resolutions. So you can get some, if you're looking for high bandwidth videos, you know, it's not going to be the highest, but you can still get some. Oh yeah, they have that. They have that. If you just go to Blender, you know, you can see on the projects, the projects page gives you direct connections over to the individual projects. And they've set up websites for each one of those. And you could download and use those. And it's good for testing. I've actually used those for testing as well.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much what we need right now. Is a high source of test on the whole entire process.
And I just used what you saw here with just the trailers. I didn't actually use the whole movies just because they're going to be bigger files. So these were just the trailers, you know, 5-8 minutes long. So you're very welcome. Hopefully it was beneficial.